Look at this pathetic excuse for a human being. Sergeant Braden Knox's voice boomed across Naval Special Warfare Command's mess hall as he watched the small woman stumble under the weight of a loaded food tray. At 6'4" with shoulders like a linebacker, Knox commanded attention whenever he spoke. And right now, every eye in the room was on him. Seriously, how do you even function in the real world? He continued, his voice dripping with theatrical disgust. I've seen wounded SEALs move faster than you. Evie had been carrying dinner trays to a corner table when her worn sneaker caught on an uneven floor tile. The crash of dishes hitting linoleum echoed through the dining hall like gunshots, followed by Knox's cruel laughter and the immediate chorus of his SEAL teammates. "Holy cow, she can't even walk straight," shouted Petty Officer Cage, pulling out his phone to record. "This is going straight to social media." At 5'2", with auburn hair pulled back in a regulation bun, Evie seemed impossibly fragile as she knelt among the scattered food and broken plates. Her simple black uniform marked her as just another civilian employee, invisible to the warriors who considered themselves America's elite. "I'm sorry, Sergeant Knox," she said quietly, her voice barely audible above the clatter. "It won't happen again." "Won't happen again?" Knox's voice rose to a mocking falsetto. "Lady, you're like a walking disaster. How did they even let you work around real operators?" But as Evie reached for the broken pieces, her left sleeve rode up slightly, revealing the edge of something dark on her wrist. Knox's predatory instincts locked in onto it immediately, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. Well, what do we have hiding under there?" In the next 20 minutes, everything these SEALs thought they knew about strength and respect would be obliterated forever. The mess hall at 1800 hours was typically chaos-controlled. 200 of America's most elite warriors refueling after grueling training rotations. Tonight felt different. The tension crackled like electricity before a storm, and Knox's theatrical cruelty had turned their usual dinner routine into public entertainment. Knox stepped closer, his combat boots crunching on broken ceramic. The sound drew more attention from nearby tables, where other SEALs paused their conversations to watch the spectacle unfold. This wasn't unusual. Knox had made tormenting the civilian staff his personal hobby, and his teammates had learned to enjoy the show. "Come on, get up!" Knox commanded, grabbing Evie's upper arm and hauling her to her feet with unnecessary force. "Let's see what kind of fake warrior princess tattoo you're hiding under there." Evie's response was measured, controlled in a way that should have been the first warning sign. Instead of crying or cowering, she simply steadied herself and met his gaze directly. Her green eyes held something that didn't quite match her timid exterior, a depth that suggested she'd seen things most people only experienced in nightmares. "Please let go of my arm, Sergeant," she said, her voice calm despite the humiliation. Knox's grip tightened instead. "Oh, now you want to give orders? That's rich coming from someone who can't even carry a tray without destroying half the mess hall." The laughter from his table grew louder, emboldening him. Petty Officer Decker, a brick wall of muscle with arms covered in legitimate military tattoos, leaned forward with interest. His own ink told stories of deployments to Afghanistan, Syria, Somalia, real operations that had earned him the right to wear the trident. "Knox, check this out," Decker called, his phone already recording. "Little Miss Butterfingers thinks she's hardcore with some basement ink." The crowd was growing. SEALs from 3 nearby tables had turned their chairs to get better views, their dinner forgotten in favor of the entertainment. Someone whistled mockingly. Another voice called out suggestions for what the tattoo might be. A butterfly, an inspirational quote, maybe some generic tribal design bought from a flash sheet. But Knox was focused on the prize. With his free hand, he reached for Evie's sleeve, pushing the black fabric up her forearm. The movement was rough, proprietary, the kind of violation that should have triggered panic or tears from a normal civilian employee. Instead, Evie's posture shifted almost imperceptibly. Her weight settled into a more balanced stance. Her free hand moved to a position that could break his grip and potentially his wrist in less than 2 seconds if she chose to. The changes were subtle, professional, and completely lost on the audience of warriors who were too busy laughing to notice they were watching a predator disguised as prey. "What is this supposed to be?" Knox's voice carried across the mess hall as he exposed the edge of black ink on her forearm. The design was immediately visible, the wingtip of what appeared to be a large bird, rendered in intricate detail with shading that spoke of expensive professional work. Before we dive deeper into this incredible story, I want you to imagine being in that mess hall, watching this unfold. If you've ever felt underestimated or dismissed, this story will hit you right in the heart. Make sure to hit that subscribe button and the notification bell, because stories like this one, where the underdog reveals their true power, are exactly what we're all about on this channel. Now, let's see what happens when Knox makes his biggest mistake. The revelation of ink seemed to energize Knox like blood in the water energizes a shark. His audience was engaged, phones were recording, and he had a captive victim who wasn't fighting back. In his mind, this was shaping up to be legendary mess hall entertainment. "Let me guess," he continued, his voice taking on the tone of a prosecutor addressing a jury. "Some generic eagle, maybe a phoenix, something you saw on Pinterest and thought would make you look tough?" He pushed her sleeve higher, revealing more of the design. The craftsmanship was immediately apparent. This wasn't amateur work done in someone's garage. The lines were clean, the shading professional, the detail work suggesting someone had paid serious money for serious artistry. But Knox was too invested in his performance to appreciate the quality. "Look at this, boys. Our little dishwasher here thinks she's some kind of badass." The laughter from his audience was getting louder, crueler. Phones were capturing every moment, already imagining the social media content this would generate. Several SEALs had abandoned their dinners entirely to crowd around for better views. That's when the first real breadcrumb dropped, though nobody except Evie herself recognized its significance. "Task Force?" someone read from the partially visible text beneath the wing. The voice belonged to Seaman Mills, a younger SEAL who was squinting at the exposed ink. "I can see letters, but can't make out the rest." Knox's eyes lit up with malicious glee. "Task Force? Oh, this keeps getting better. What's next, Princess? Gonna to tell us you're some kind of secret agent?" But Mills was frowning now, his expression shifting from amusement to confusion. He'd been deployed enough to recognize military tattoos when he saw them, and something about this one was bothering him. The quality was too high, the placement too precise, the partial text too specific. "Knox, Indy," Mills said carefully, "maybe we should..." "Should what?" Knox cut him off. "Let her keep pretending she's something she's not? This is stolen valor, Mills. Fake military ink on some civilian who's never seen a day of real service." The accusation hung in the air like poison gas. Stolen valor, the crime of claiming military service or honors never earned, was one of the most serious charges you could level in a room full of actual warriors. It was the kind of accusation that could destroy careers, end relationships, and turn communities against you. Evie's reaction to the charge was telling, though again, nobody was paying close enough attention to read the signs. Instead of the angry denial or tearful protestation you would expect from a falsely accused civilian, she simply nodded once as if accepting that this confrontation had been inevitable. "Sergeant Knox," she said, her voice still maddeningly calm, "you're making a mistake." The response sent Knox into overdrive. "A mistake? The only mistake here is whoever hired someone stupid enough to get fake military ink and then wear it to work around actual operators." He yanked her sleeve up further, exposing almost the entire forearm now. The design was a masterwork, a raven in full flight, wings spread wide, clutching a lightning bolt in its talons. The detail work was extraordinary, from the individual feathers to the fierce intelligence in the bird's eyes. Below it, in Gothic script that was partially visible, were words that made Mills take an involuntary step backward. "Task Force Raven," Mills read aloud, his voice much quieter now. The laughter in the immediate vicinity began to die down. Not because anyone recognized the unit. Task Force Raven's operations were classified at levels that didn't appear on any public roster, but because the quality and specificity of the tattoo was starting to feel less like basement amateur work, and more like something with actual meaning behind it. Knox, however, was too committed to his performance to recognize the changing mood. "Task Force Raven, are you kidding me with this nonsense? I've been deployed to every sandbox from here to Syria, and there's no such thing as Task Force Raven." That's when Murphy emerged from the kitchen. Chief Petty Officer Sean Murphy was 62 years old, built like a fire hydrant, and had been feeding SEALs for longer than most of the current team had been alive. His weathered face bore the scars of 2 tours in Vietnam and 3 more in various Middle Eastern deployments before he'd taken over mess hall operations. If anyone on base commanded universal respect, it was Murphy. "Knox," Murphy's voice cut through the noise like a blade, "step away from my employee." Knox turned, still gripping Evie's arm, his face flushed with righteous indignation. Chief, you need to know what you've got working in your kitchen. This woman is wearing fake military ink, claiming service she never earned. Murphy's eyes moved from Knox to Evie, taking in the exposed tattoo, the crowd of onlookers, the phones recording everything. His expression was unreadable, but those who knew him well might have noticed the slight tightening around his eyes that suggested he was processing information the others were missing. Son, Murphy said carefully, I think you should let go of her arm and get back to your dinner. Not until she explains why she thinks it's okay to mock our service with this fake ink. Knox's voice was rising now, playing to his audience. Look at this thing, Task Force Raven. She probably found it on some military fantasy website. Murphy stepped closer, his voice dropping to a tone that made smart people pay attention. Knox, I'm telling you to let go of her arm. Right now. The authority in Murphy's voice should have been enough, but Knox was too deep into his performance, too invested in the humiliation he was orchestrating. The crowd was watching, phones were recording, and backing down now would mean losing face in front of his teammates. Chief, with all due respect, this is about honor, about respect for the uniform and the service we've all sworn to. I'm not going to stand by and watch some civilian mock what we've bled for. It was at that moment that Commander Walsh entered the mess hall. Commander James Walsh was 48 years old, carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who'd commanded in every major conflict of the past 2 decades, and had the kind of presence that made conversations stop when he walked into a room. Tonight was no exception. The mess hall didn't exactly fall silent, but the volume dropped noticeably as heads turned toward the entry. Walsh's dress uniform was impeccable, his silver oak leaves gleaming under the fluorescent lights, his expression neutral as he assessed the situation. His eyes took in the crowd first, then the phones recording, then Knox's grip on the small woman's arm, and finally the exposed tattoo that was causing all the commotion. His scan of the situation was thorough, professional, and concluded with his gaze settling on Evie's face. For just a moment, something flickered in the commander's expression, recognition, surprise. It was too quick to read, but it was definitely something. What's the situation here? Walsh's voice carried the kind of authority that made people straighten their spines automatically. Knox, seeing an opportunity to elevate his case to higher authority, launched into his explanation with renewed energy. Sir, this civilian employee is wearing fake military tattoos. Stolen valor, sir. I caught her wearing this Task Force Raven ink and claiming service she obviously never earned. Walsh moved closer, his attention focused entirely on the tattoo now fully visible on Evie's forearm. The detail work was extraordinary, professional military ink of the highest quality. The Raven design was fierce, predatory, clearly the work of someone who understood the symbolism they were creating. Task Force Raven, Walsh said quietly, more to himself than to anyone else. Knox took this as validation. Exactly, sir. There's no such unit. She's making a mockery of actual service members with this fake ink. But Walsh wasn't looking at Knox anymore. His attention was entirely focused on Evie now, studying her face with the intensity of someone trying to solve a puzzle. The tattoo was one thing, but there was something about her that was triggering memories he couldn't quite place. Ma'am, Walsh said, addressing Evie directly for the first time, could you tell me your name? Evie's response was immediate and crisp, delivered with a precision that should have been another warning sign. Evelyn Thorne, sir. The name hit Walsh like a physical blow. His expression shifted from professional curiosity to something approaching shock, though he covered it quickly. In the classified world of special operations, names like Evelyn Thorne didn't just disappear, they became legends whispered in briefing rooms and carved into memorial walls. Knox, oblivious to the change in Walsh's demeanor, pressed his advantage. Sir, I recommend we document this stolen valor incident. This kind of disrespect to actual service members can't be tolerated. Walsh reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone, his movements deliberate and careful. Knox, I think you need to step back and let me handle this. Sir, if I may, I think it's important that everyone sees what happens when Knox. Walsh's voice carried a finality that made the sergeant's mouth snap shut. Step back. The authority in Walsh's tone was absolute, and even Knox recognized that he had pushed as far as he safely could. He released Evie's arm but remained close, still confident that he was in the right, still certain that higher authority would validate his actions. Walsh's fingers moved across his phone's screen with practiced efficiency, navigating to databases that existed at classification levels most of the SEALs in the room would never access. The search took less than 30 seconds, but those 30 seconds stretched like hours in the tense silence of the mess hall. When Walsh's screen populated with results, his face went pale. The change was dramatic enough that even Knox noticed it. "Sir, is everything all right?" Walsh looked up from his phone, his eyes moving from the screen to Evie to the tattoo and back to the screen again. When he spoke, his voice carried a weight that made everyone in the immediate vicinity pay attention. "Gentlemen," he said, addressing the crowd of SEALs who had gathered to watch the spectacle, "I believe you've been questioning the service record of Master Chief Petty Officer Evelyn Thorne, United States Navy, retired." The words fell into the mess hall like grenades. Knox's mouth fell open. Mills went pale. The phones that had been recording everything suddenly seemed heavy in their owner's hands, as if they had been documenting something they weren't supposed to see. "Master Chief," someone whispered from the crowd. Walsh continued, his voice growing stronger as he read from his phone. 16 years of active service, multiple deployments to classified locations. Task Force Raven was a joint special operations unit that conducted direct action missions in Syria, Afghanistan, and other locations that remained classified. The silence in the mess hall was now absolute. Every conversation had stopped. Every eye was focused on the small woman who had just been revealed as one of the most elite warriors any of them had ever stood in the same room with. Task Force Raven operated from 2012 to 2018, Walsh continued. 7 members total. Their mission parameters remained classified at the highest levels, but their operational success rate was 100% across 43 confirmed missions. Knox looked like he might be sick. The confidence that had carried him through his assault on Evie was evaporating like water in a desert, replaced by the dawning realization that he had just committed career suicide in front of witnesses. But Walsh wasn't finished. Master Chief Thorne's decorations include the Navy Cross, 3 bronze stars with valor, the Purple Heart with 3 oak leaf clusters, and medals from classified operations that I'm not authorized to discuss in this setting. He looked up from his phone, his eyes finding Evie's with an expression that mixed respect, recognition, and something approaching awe. "The Raven tattoo," he continued, "represents the Silent Watch, the guardian in darkness. It's awarded only to members of Task Force Raven who have completed the full operational cycle. Of the 7 people who earned this marking, only 4 are still alive. The advanced communication systems used in modern military operations require sophisticated encryption technology that protects sensitive information during critical missions. These high-security communication devices feature military-grade encryption, extended battery life, and ruggedized construction designed to withstand extreme operational environments. Professional-grade communication equipment provides the reliability and security that military personnel depend on when lives are on the line, offering features that civilian devices simply cannot match. The revelation of Evie's true identity had sent shockwaves through the mess hall, but Walsh was still processing the implications of what he'd just discovered. Master Chief Evelyn Thorne wasn't just a decorated veteran. She was a legend in the special operations community, someone whose exploits had been briefed at the highest levels of command. "Master Chief," Walsh said, his voice carrying both respect and curiosity, "if I may ask, what brings you to our humble mess hall?" Evie's response was characteristic, brief, professional, and revealing nothing more than necessary. "Retirement, sir. Sometimes the best hiding place is in plain sight." The simplicity of her answer only deepened the mystery. Why would someone with her background choose to work as a civilian employee in a military mess hall? Why endure the daily indignities of serving food to young warriors who had no idea who she was? Knox, meanwhile, was spiraling through the stages of shock, denial, and dawning horror as he realized the magnitude of his mistake. He'd just publicly humiliated, physically assaulted, and accused of stolen valor one of the most decorated special operations veterans in recent history. The phones that had captured every moment of his behavior now felt like evidence in his own court-martial. "Sir," Knox stammered, his voice barely audible, I didn't know." Walsh's expression as he turned to Knox was arctic. "You didn't know because you didn't ask. You saw someone you perceived as weak and decided to make her your entertainment. You violated every principle of leadership, respect, and military bearing that we're supposed to embody." The crowd of SEALs who had been enjoying the show, minutes earlier now found themselves uncomfortably aware that their own behavior was being scrutinized. How many of them had laughed? How many had recorded? How many had stood by and watched a decorated veteran be humiliated without intervening? Mills stepped forward, his face pale with shame. "Master Chief, we owe you an apology. We had no right to—" Evie raised a hand, stopping him mid-sentence. When she spoke, her voice carried the authority of someone who had commanded respect in the most dangerous places on Earth. "The service isn't about proving yourself to others," she said, her words cutting through the silence like a blade. "It's about being worthy of the trust placed in you. Real operators don't need recognition. They just do the job." She looked around the room, taking in the faces of young warriors who were learning a lesson they'd never forget. The raven flies silent, sees all, protects all. That's the only validation that matters. The philosophical weight of her words settled over the mess hall like a blanket. These were warriors who understood sacrifice, commitment, and duty, but they were also young men who had been caught up in pack mentality and cruelty. The lesson was hitting them with the force of a physical blow. Walsh pulled out his wallet and placed a $20 bill on the nearest table. "Coffee's on me tonight, Master Chief. Thank you for your continued service to this community." As he turned to leave, his voice carried across the mess hall with command authority. "Knox, Decker, Mills, my office at 0600 hours tomorrow. We're going to discuss how members of my command treat fellow service members, active or retired." The three men snapped to attention automatically, their faces reflecting the understanding that their careers had just taken a serious hit. Knox's dreams of advancement, of special recognition, of becoming a legend in his own right, were crumbling around him as he realized he'd become a cautionary tale instead. But Evie wasn't finished. As Walsh reached the exit, she spoke again, her voice carrying across the silent mess hall. "Commander Walsh!" He turned back, his expression respectful but curious. "Permission to continue my shift, sir. These trays won't clean themselves." The request was so unexpected, so humble, that it sent another wave of realization through the assembled SEALs. She wasn't going to leverage her revealed status for special treatment. She wasn't going to demand apologies or punishment for her tormentors. She was simply going to return to work, as if nothing had changed. Walsh's smile was small but genuine. "Permission granted, Master Chief, and thank you for the reminder about what service really means." As the commander left, the mess hall slowly began to resume normal operations, but the atmosphere had fundamentally changed. The young SEALs who had been so quick to mock and humiliate were now watching a living legend clear tables and refill coffee pots with the same quiet efficiency she'd shown before her identity was revealed. Knox remained frozen near the spot where the confrontation had occurred, his mind replaying every cruel word, every moment of public humiliation he'd orchestrated. The phones that had captured his behavior were already uploading to social media, but now, instead of documenting his dominance over a weak civilian, they were preserving evidence of his assault on a decorated war hero. "This is getting intense, and I can tell you're as hooked as I am. If you're enjoying this story of hidden strength and respect earned the hard way, smash that like button to help others find it. Trust me, you're going to want to see what happens when the truth comes out." The immediate aftermath of the revelation created a ripple effect that spread far beyond the mess hall. Within hours, the story would be circulating through every special operations community on the planet. The video footage, which had started as cruel entertainment, would become a viral sensation and a teaching tool about respect, assumption, and the heroes who walk among us unrecognized. But in the moment, into the immediate silence that followed Walsh's departure, something more profound was happening. The young warriors who had learned to see civilians as lesser beings were being forced to confront the possibility that anyone they dismissed might be carrying secrets, experiences, and service records that would shame their own. Mills approached Evie cautiously, his earlier bravado completely evaporated. "Master Chief, we were wrong, completely, inexcusably wrong." Evie looked up from the broken dishes she was still collecting, her expression neither angry nor forgiving, simply professional. "You were operating on incomplete information, Seaman Mills. It happens. The question is what you learn from it." The response was so characteristic of a senior leader, turning a moment of shame into a teaching opportunity, that Mills felt the full weight of his behavior crash down on him. This woman had probably mentored dozens of young warriors over her career, had probably saved lives, had probably made the kind of sacrifices that most people couldn't imagine, and they had spent the evening treating her like entertainment. Decker, who had been one of the most enthusiastic participants in the humiliation, found himself unable to speak. His own military tattoos, ink he'd earned through deployments and combat operations, suddenly felt inadequate compared to the simple, elegant Raven that marked Evie as someone who had operated at levels he might never achieve. The transformation in the mess hall's atmosphere was palpable. Conversations that had resumed were quieter, more thoughtful. The casual arrogance that had characterized the evening's earlier interactions was replaced by something approaching introspection. Murphy emerged from the kitchen, carrying a fresh pot of coffee, and wearing an expression that suggested he'd known more about Evie's background than he'd let on. As he approached her table, several SEALs instinctively stood, showing the kind of respect they'd failed to demonstrate earlier. "Figured you might need this about now," Murphy said, setting the coffee pot down and producing 2 cups from his apron. "It's been a long evening." Evie's smile was the first genuine warmth she'd shown all night. "Thank you, Chief. I appreciate it." As Murphy poured coffee for both of them, his voice carried just loud enough for the nearby tables to hear. "You know, in 16 years of running this mess hall, I've served a lot of warriors. Some I remember for their achievements, some for their attitudes, some for their character. But I've never had the honor of serving someone with your particular set of credentials." The statement was clearly intended for the listening audience, a gentle but firm reminder that respect should be given before it's demanded, that assumptions are dangerous, and that true warriors come in all shapes and sizes. Knox, who had remained frozen in place since the revelation, finally found his voice. "Master Chief, there's no excuse for what I did, no justification for how I treated you. I dishonored everything I'm supposed to represent." Evie set down her coffee cup and looked at him directly. For the first time since her identity had been revealed, the eye contact was steady, evaluating, the kind of assessment that leaders make when deciding whether someone can be salvaged or is too damaged to save. "Sergeant Knox," she said, her voice carrying the authority of rank even in retirement, "you made a mistake, a serious one. The question now is whether you learn from it or let it define you." The response was classic military leadership, acknowledging the failure while offering a path to redemption. It was the kind of mentoring that had probably saved dozens of careers over the years. The wisdom that comes from understanding that good people sometimes do stupid things under pressure. Knox's relief was visible, though tempered by the understanding that his actions would have consequences regardless of Evie's forgiveness. The videos were already online. His behavior had been witnessed by dozens of his peers. His reputation would never fully recover from the night he attacked a Medal of Honor caliber veteran. But the grace Evie was showing him, the opportunity to learn rather than simply be destroyed, was more than he deserved, and exactly what he needed. As the evening continued, the dynamic in the mess hall continued to evolve. Young SEALs who had never given a thought to the civilian staff were suddenly aware that anyone might be carrying secrets, experiences, or qualifications that would humble their own achievements. The casual disrespect that had characterized their earlier behavior was replaced by something approaching curiosity about the people who served them. Evie continued her shift with the same quiet efficiency she'd shown before the revelation, but now her movements were being watched with something approaching awe. The way she organized the serving line spoke of logistical expertise earned in combat zones. The efficiency with which she handled multiple tasks simultaneously reflected training in time-critical environments where mistakes could cost lives. Even the simple act of wiping down tables became a study in tactical awareness as observant SEALs noticed how she positioned herself to maintain sightlines to all entrances, how she moved in patterns that kept her back covered, how she unconsciously cataloged every person in the room and their positions relative to potential threats. These weren't the movements of a civilian who had learned military habits through proximity. These were the instincts of someone who had lived in environments where situational awareness was the difference between coming home and being shipped home in a flag-draped box. Military veterans transitioning to civilian careers often face unique financial challenges that require specialized investment and insurance solutions. Professional financial services designed specifically for former special operations personnel provide comprehensive wealth management, retirement planning, and risk assessment that accounts for the unique career patterns and compensation structures of military service. These specialized financial products offer the security and growth potential that veterans need to build long-term financial stability. The financial reality of military service was something every person in the mess hall understood intimately. The specialized challenges faced by veterans, particularly those transitioning from classified operations to civilian life, created unique needs that traditional financial institutions often failed to address adequately. As the evening wound down and the mess hall began to empty, Evie found herself approached by a steady stream of young SEALs who wanted to apologize, to ask questions, or simply to be in the presence of someone who represented the pinnacle of their profession. Each interaction was handled with the same grace and professionalism that had characterized her response to the initial assault. "Master Chief," asked a young petty officer who had remained silent during the earlier confrontation, "if you don't mind me asking, why choose this? Why work here instead of taking some high-paying contractor job or government position?" Evie's answer was immediate and sincere. "Because this matters. Feeding warriors matters. Making sure you have the fuel you need to do your jobs matters. Service doesn't end when you retire, it just changes form." The response encapsulated everything the young SEALs were beginning to understand about true leadership, about service that continued beyond uniform and rank, about finding meaning in mission, regardless of recognition or reward. As closing time approached, the mess hall had been transformed from a place of casual cruelty into something approaching a classroom. Young warriors who had started the evening believing their own hype were ending it with a deeper understanding of humility, respect, and the complexity of the people around them. Knox remained until the end, helping to clean up in a way that felt more like penance than courtesy. His earlier arrogance had been completely replaced by a kind of shell-shocked humility that suggested he was still processing the magnitude of his mistake. "Master Chief," he said as Evie prepared to leave, "I know I don't deserve it, but I want to learn from this. I want to be better than what I showed tonight." Evie paused at the exit, her hand on the door, and looked back at the young sergeant who had started the evening as her tormentor and was ending it as someone genuinely seeking redemption. "The hardest battles we fight are often with ourselves, Sergeant Knox. The enemy isn't always across the battlefield. Sometimes it's in the mirror. Tonight you saw who you were. Tomorrow, you get to decide who you want to be." With that, she was gone, leaving behind a mess hall full of young warriors who would never again look at civilian staff, or anyone else they might be tempted to dismiss, the same way. The story of what happened in the mess hall that night would become legend within hours. The videos would go viral within days. The lesson about respect, assumption, and hidden strength would be taught in leadership schools for years to come. But the most important impact was immediate and personal, the understanding that heroes walk among us every day, that service takes many forms, and that true strength often reveals itself not in dominance over others, but in grace under pressure and the willingness to turn moments of conflict into opportunities for growth. Knox would spend the rest of his career living down the night he attacked a decorated veteran, but he would also spend it living up to the lesson she taught him about redemption, growth, and the possibility that even our worst moments can become catalysts for becoming our best selves. We're approaching the moment that changes everything. This is why I love telling these stories. They remind us that heroes walk among us every day. If this story is giving you chills, share it with someone who needs to be reminded that true strength often comes in unexpected packages. The morning after the mess hall incident brought consequences that rippled through Naval Special Warfare Command like seismic waves. Knox, Decker, and Mills found themselves standing at attention outside Commander Walsh's office at precisely 0600 hours. Their dress uniforms crisp, but their faces bearing the weight of men who knew their careers hung in the balance. Walsh's office was spartanly decorated, a few commendations on the wall, a flag in the corner, and a desk that spoke of a man who believed in efficiency over ego. The commander himself sat behind that desk with the kind of stillness that made smart subordinates very nervous. "Gentlemen," Walsh began, his voice carrying the formal tone reserved for serious disciplinary matters. "Last night you participated in the public humiliation of Master Chief Petty Officer Evelyn Thorne. You filmed it. You encouraged it. You turned one of America's most decorated special operations veterans into entertainment for your social media feeds." The words hit like physical blows. Knox felt his stomach drop as he realized the full scope of what had been captured on video. Not just his own behavior, but the complicity of everyone who had watched, laughed, and recorded without intervening. "Sir," Knox began, but Walsh cut him off with a raised hand. "You will speak when I give you permission to speak, Sergeant Knox. Right now, you will listen." Walsh stood and moved to the window overlooking the training yard where young SEALs were beginning their morning PT. Master Chief Thorne's operational record is classified at levels that require clearances none of you possess. What I can tell you is that she has personally saved the lives of more American service members than most units save in their entire existence. He turned back to face the three men, his expression grim. The woman you mocked last night once held off an entire Taliban compound single-handedly for 6 hours while evacuating wounded civilians and coalition personnel. She has been shot, stabbed, blown up, and captured by enemy forces, and she has never, not once, failed to complete a mission or bring her people home. Mills felt tears forming in his eyes as the full weight of their behavior settled on him. They hadn't just bullied a civilian employee, they had tormented someone whose service record would put their own achievements to shame. The Raven tattoo you found so amusing, Walsh continued, marks her as a member of the most elite counterterrorism unit in modern history. Task Force Raven conducted operations so classified that their existence is known only to a handful of people at the highest levels of government. Walsh returned to his desk and pulled out 3 folders, setting them down with deliberate precision. These are your service records. Knox, 4 years active duty, 2 deployments, good performance reviews, but nothing exceptional. Decker, 6 years, 3 deployments, solid operator, but again, nothing that would distinguish you from thousands of others. Mills, 2 years, 1 deployment, still learning your craft. The comparison was devastating, without being explicit. 3 careers that represented good, solid service, but nothing approaching the legendary status of the woman they had spent the evening humiliating. "Sir," Knox said, his voice barely above a whisper, "we understand the severity of our actions. We're prepared to accept whatever consequences you deem appropriate." Walsh's expression softened slightly, recognizing genuine remorse when he saw it. "The consequences aren't mine to determine alone, gentlemen. The videos of your behavior are already viral. The Navy's Public Affairs Office is fielding calls from reporters who want to know how 3 Navy SEALs ended up assaulting a decorated veteran in a military mess hall. The implication was clear. Their careers weren't just at risk from military discipline, but from public scrutiny that could follow them for the rest of their lives. However, Walsh continued, Master Chief Thorne has specifically requested that no formal charges be filed. She believes you can learn from this experience and become better leaders as a result. The relief was visible on all 3 faces, though tempered by the understanding that professional and personal consequences would follow, regardless of formal charges. You will each write a detailed report explaining your actions, your thought process, and what you learned from the experience. These reports will become part of your permanent records and will be used as training materials for future leadership development programs. Mills stepped forward slightly. "Sir, if I may, we'd also like to write personal apologies to Master Chief Thorne, not because we're required to, but because she deserves to hear that we understand how wrong we were." Walsh nodded approvingly. "That's exactly the kind of initiative that suggests you might actually learn from this experience, Mills. The apologies will be handwritten, formal, and delivered personally." As the 3 men prepared to leave, Walsh stopped them with one final observation. "Gentlemen, you encountered a living legend last night and treated her like garbage. Master Chief Thorne represents everything we aspire to be as warriors: skilled, humble, dedicated to service above self. The fact that she forgave you and advocated for your futures tells you everything you need to know about her character. I suggest you spend some time thinking about what it tells you about yours." The dismissal was clear, and the 3 SEALs filed out of Walsh's office carrying the weight of shame, gratitude, and a profound new understanding of what leadership actually looked like. Meanwhile, in the mess hall, Evie was beginning another shift with the same quiet efficiency that had characterized her work for months. But the atmosphere had fundamentally changed. SEALs who had previously ignored the civilian staff now nodded respectfully as they passed. Conversations were quieter, more thoughtful. The casual arrogance that had permeated the space had been replaced by something approaching introspection. Murphy emerged from the kitchen carrying a fresh pot of coffee and wearing an expression of quiet satisfaction. "Heard Walsh had a conversation with the troublemakers this morning," he said, refilling Evie's cup. "Everyone deserves a chance to learn from their mistakes," Evie replied, her tone suggesting the matter was closed as far as she was concerned. "Most people, sure," Murphy agreed, "but not everyone gets that chance from someone like you. Those boys don't know how lucky they are." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a young petty officer who approached their table with obvious nervousness. "Master Chief Thorne, I'm Petty Officer Rodriguez. I wanted to apologize for last night. I didn't participate directly, but I didn't stop it either, and that makes me complicit." Evie looked up from her coffee, assessing the young sailor with the same evaluating gaze she'd used on Knox. Rodriguez was small, earnest, and clearly struggling with questions about courage, leadership, and moral responsibility. "Petty Officer Rodriguez," Evie said, "the hardest position to be in during a situation like last night is the middle ground. It takes courage to intervene, but it also takes wisdom to know when intervention will help and when it will just escalate the situation." Rodriguez's relief was visible. "I've been thinking about it all night, trying to figure out what I should have done differently." "Good," Evie said simply. "That kind of self-reflection is how we grow as leaders. The fact that you're here now, taking responsibility for your inaction, tells me you learned something valuable." The interaction was classic military mentoring, taking a moment of failure and turning it into a learning opportunity, helping a young warrior understand that moral courage was just as important as physical bravery. As Rodriguez left, visibly buoyed by the conversation, Murphy shook his head in admiration. 16 years I've been watching warriors come and go through this mess hall. I've seen heroes, legends, and everything in between, but I've never seen anyone turn a personal attack into a teaching moment for an entire command." Evie's response was characteristic in its simplicity. "That's what leaders do, Chief. We turn obstacles into opportunities, failures into lessons, and conflicts into chances for growth. Advanced tactical training programs and specialized military education courses provide professional development opportunities that enhance career prospects for both active duty and veteran personnel. These comprehensive educational frameworks offer certifications in leadership, advanced technical skills, and strategic planning that translate directly to civilian career advancement. Professional military education services ensure that service members and veterans can leverage their unique experience and training in competitive civilian markets. The educational component of military service extended far beyond tactical skills and weapon proficiency. True military education involved understanding human nature, motivation, leadership under pressure, and the ability to turn any situation into a learning opportunity for yourself and others. As the day progressed, Evie found herself approached by a steady stream of young SEALs who wanted to hear her perspective on leadership, service, and the transition from active duty to civilian life. Each conversation was handled with the same patience and wisdom that had characterized her response to the previous night's assault. "Master Chief," asked a young seaman who couldn't have been more than 22, "how do you deal with the transition from being someone who commanded respect through rank to being someone who has to earn it through actions?" The question was sophisticated, suggesting the young sailor had been thinking deeply about identity, purpose, and the nature of authority. "The truth is," Evie replied, "real respect was never about the rank. Rank can command obedience, but respect has to be earned through character, competence, and commitment to something bigger than yourself. In some ways, civilian life gives you a clearer picture of who you really are when you strip away the uniform and the title." The answer sparked a broader conversation about purpose, service, and the ways that military values could be applied in civilian contexts. Other SEALs began gathering around the table, drawn by the opportunity to learn from someone who had successfully navigated the transition they would all eventually face. "But don't you miss the action?" asked another young warrior. "The adrenaline, the sense of mission, the brotherhood of combat operations?" Evie's smile was understanding. "I miss the people. I miss knowing that everyone around me was committed to the same values and willing to sacrifice for the same cause. But action without purpose is just violence, and adrenaline without mission is just addiction. The question isn't whether you miss what you did, it's whether you can find new ways to serve the same values in different contexts." The conversation was drawing a crowd now, as word spread that Master Chief Thorne was holding an informal leadership seminar in the mess hall. Young SEALs who had never given serious thought to life after service were suddenly confronted with questions about purpose, identity, and the ways that warrior values could be applied in civilian life. The aftermath of this revelation is absolutely incredible. If you want more stories about unsung heroes and the respect they have earned, check out the video I'm posting next week. about the quiet janitor who turned out to be a Medal of Honor recipient. The link is in the description below. The ripple effects of the mess hall incident continued to spread far beyond Naval Special Warfare Command. The videos, which had started as cruel entertainment, were now being shared as examples of hidden heroism and the dangers of assumption. Social media platforms that had initially hosted the content as Schadenfreude were now featuring it as inspiration and education. Major news outlets picked up the story within 48 hours. The narrative of a decorated special operations veteran working quietly in a military mess hall while being humiliated by young SEALs who didn't recognize her significance resonated with audiences who were hungry for stories about real heroism and authentic service. The Pentagon's Public Affairs Office found itself in the unusual position of managing a positive story about military values, but one that also highlighted problems with military culture and the treatment of veterans. The official statement praised Master Chief Thorne's service while emphasizing the importance of respect for all service members, active and retired. But the most significant impact was on the young warriors who witnessed the transformation firsthand. The mess hall had become an informal classroom, where lessons about leadership, humility, and service were being taught through example, rather than lecture. Knox, Decker, and Mills delivered their personal apologies to Evie 3 days after the incident. Each letter was handwritten, formal, and reflected genuine remorse combined with gratitude for the grace she had shown them. The apologies were accepted with the same professionalism that had characterized all of Evie's interactions since her identity was revealed. "Master Chief," Knox said as he handed over his letter, "I know this doesn't undo what happened, but I want you to know that I've learned more about leadership from your response than I did from 4 years of military training." Evie's response was characteristic. "The best lessons often come from our worst moments, Sergeant Knox. The question is whether we let those moments define us or refine us." As the immediate crisis began to settle, a new dynamic emerged in the mess hall. The casual disrespect that had characterized interactions between warriors and support staff was replaced by something approaching professional courtesy. Young SEALs who had never considered the backgrounds, experiences, or qualifications of civilian employees were suddenly aware that anyone might be carrying secrets that would humble their own achievements. The transformation wasn't universal or immediate, but it was noticeable. Conversations were more thoughtful. Assumptions were questioned. The automatic arrogance that came with being part of an elite unit was tempered by the understanding that elite service took many forms and didn't always announce itself. Murphy, who had been observing the changes from his position in the kitchen, found himself impressed by the depth of the transformation. 16 years of trying to teach these knuckleheads about respect, he told Evie during a quiet moment. "And you accomplished more in one evening than I managed in a decade and a half." Evie's response was typical in its deflection of credit. "They were ready to learn, Chief. Sometimes it just takes the right circumstances to open people's minds to lessons they need to hear." The circumstances had certainly been dramatic enough to capture attention, but the lasting impact came from Evie's response to the crisis. The grace under pressure, the willingness to forgive, and the ability to turn a moment of personal attack into a teaching opportunity for an entire command. These were the qualities that transformed a viral video into a lasting lesson about leadership and character. As weeks passed, the story continued to evolve. Military leadership schools began using the incident as a case study in respect, assumption, and the complexity of veteran experiences. The videos were incorporated into training programs designed to help young warriors understand that service takes many forms and that heroes often work in the shadows without recognition or reward. But perhaps the most significant long-term impact was on the individuals directly involved. Knox, Decker, and Mills found themselves changed by the experience in ways that would influence their entire careers. The humility they learned from being corrected by someone they had dismissed as inferior became a foundation for more thoughtful leadership as they advanced through the ranks. Rodriguez, the young petty officer who had approached Evie to apologize for his inaction, found himself inspired to pursue advanced leadership training. The conversation about moral courage and the responsibility to intervene in unjust situations became a guiding principle in his development as a leader. Even the SEALs who had only witnessed the events, rather than participating directly, found themselves changed by the experience. The understanding that anyone they might be tempted to dismiss could be carrying experiences, qualifications, and service records that would shame their own achievements became a permanent part of their worldview. The mess hall itself became something of a pilgrimage site for military personnel who had heard the story. Visitors would ask to see where the confrontation occurred, where Master Chief Thorne had revealed her identity, where young warriors learned unforgettable lessons about respect and assumption. But Evie herself remained unchanged by the attention. She continued her shift work with the same quiet efficiency she had shown before her identity was revealed. The respect she now received was acknowledged but not leveraged. The opportunities for speaking engagements, book deals, and consulting contracts were politely declined in favor of continuing the work she had chosen in retirement. "The mission doesn't change because people know who you are," she explained to Murphy during one of their regular coffee conversations. "Service is about what you do, not about who knows you're doing it." This commitment to service without recognition became its own form of leadership education for the young warriors who observed it daily. They were watching someone who had achieved the highest levels of professional success choose humility, simplicity, and continued service over fame, fortune, and acclaim. The lesson was powerful and clear. True warriors serve because they believe in the mission, not because they want recognition for their sacrifice. As the immediate drama of the revelation faded into routine, the deeper lessons began to take root. The mess hall that had witnessed a moment of cruel entertainment followed by profound revelation, had become a classroom where the most important military values were being taught through example rather than instruction. Young SEALs who had started their careers believing that strength meant dominance over others were learning that true strength often revealed itself through grace under pressure and the willingness to forgive those who had wronged you. Warriors who had assumed that respect was automatically owed based on their elite status were discovering that respect had to be earned through character, competence, and commitment to values larger than self-interest. The story of Master Chief Evelyn Thorne and the night she revealed her identity in a military mess hall would be told for years to come. But the real impact wasn't in the dramatic moment of revelation. It was in the quiet daily example of someone who continued to serve with honor, humility, and grace long after her official service had ended. The Raven tattoo that had started as a target for mockery had become a symbol of something much larger. The understanding that heroes walk among us every day, that service takes many forms, and that true strength often comes disguised as vulnerability until the moment when circumstances demand its revelation. And in that revelation, everyone present had learned something about themselves, about leadership, and about the complex, challenging, and ultimately rewarding nature of a life dedicated to service above self. The days following the initial revelation brought an unexpected intensity to Naval Special Warfare Command that had nothing to do with training schedules or deployment preparations. Word of Master Chief Evelyn Thorne's presence had spread through the special operations community like wildfire, creating an undercurrent of curiosity and respect that transformed the atmosphere of the entire base. But Knox wasn't finished. The partial revelation of Evie's identity had only intensified his need to prove himself right, to somehow salvage his position from the wreckage of his assumptions. 3 days after Commander Walsh's office meeting, as Evie worked her evening shift in the mess hall, Knox approached her table with the desperate energy of a man whose world had been turned upside down. "Master Chief," he said, his voice carrying an edge that made nearby SEALs look up from their conversations. "I've been thinking about what happened, and something doesn't add up." Evie looked up from the inventory sheets she was reviewing, her expression neutral but alert. The mess hall around them gradually quieted as conversations died and attention focused on what appeared to be round 2 of a confrontation most people thought had been resolved. "Sergeant Knox," Evie said calmly, "what exactly doesn't add up?" Knox's confidence was building now, fueled by 3 days of research, whispered conversations, and the desperate need to prove that he hadn't made a complete fool of himself in front of his entire command. "I've been asking around, checking databases I have access to. And you know what I've found?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Other SEALs were abandoning their dinners now, sensing that whatever was about to happen would be worth witnessing. "Task Force Raven is real," Knox continued, his voice gaining strength. "But according to my sources, all 7 members were killed in action in Syria in 2017. Every single one of them died in a classified operation that went wrong." The accusation was devastating in its implications. Knox wasn't just questioning Evie's credentials now, he was suggesting she had stolen the identity of a dead hero, that her tattoo was a memorial to someone else's sacrifice rather than evidence of her own service. Murmurs rippled through the assembled crowd. This wasn't the simple stolen valor accusation of a few nights earlier. This was something much more serious, much more specific, and much more damning if it proved to be true. Evie's response was measured, controlled, and entirely inadequate to the magnitude of the charge being leveled against her. "Sergeant Knox, you're operating on incomplete information." "Incomplete?" Knox's voice was rising now, his confidence building with each word. "Master Chief, I have documentation. Official reports. 7 operators went into Syria in March of 2017. None of them came back. The unit was disbanded, the mission classified, and the records sealed. The silence in the mess hall was absolute now. Even Murphy had emerged from the kitchen, drawn by the intensity of the confrontation and the seriousness of the allegations being made. Knox reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded document, unfolding it with theatrical precision. After-action report from Operation Nightfall. 7 operators from Task Force Raven entered Syrian airspace on March 15, 2017. Mission parameters classified. Results classified. Personnel status. All 7 listed as killed in action. He held the document up like evidence in a trial, his voice carrying across the silent mess hall with prosecutorial authority. "So, either you're claiming to be a ghost, Master Chief, or you're wearing the identity of a dead hero. Which is it?" The accusation hit the assembled SEALs like a physical blow. The respect that had been building for Evie over the past 3 days evaporated in an instant, replaced by suspicion, confusion, and the uncomfortable realization that they might have been deceived by someone playing an elaborate and deeply offensive con game. Evie looked around the room, taking in the faces of young warriors who had been prepared to believe in her story, but were now confronted with official documentation that contradicted everything they'd been told. The silence stretched like a taut wire, building tension that threatened to snap into violence or chaos. "Sergeant Knox," Evie said finally, her voice still maddeningly calm despite the severity of the charges against her, "you're right about Operation Nightfall. 7 members of Task Force Raven did enter Syrian airspace on March 15, 2017. Knox's vindication was visible on his face. After days of doubt and humiliation, he was finally being proven right in front of the same audience that had witnessed his earlier defeat. "And you're right that none of them came back," Evie continued, standing slowly from her chair, at least not in any way that could be officially acknowledged. The qualifier was subtle but significant. Knox frowned, sensing that his moment of triumph was about to be complicated by details he hadn't considered. "What do you mean, officially acknowledged?" Knox demanded. Evie looked around the room one more time, her gaze settling on each face, memorizing the moment before everything changed forever. When she spoke again, her voice carried the weight of someone who had lived through nightmares that most people couldn't imagine. "The mission went wrong from the beginning. Intelligence was compromised. What was supposed to be a simple extraction turned into a 6-day running battle against overwhelming odds. By the time support arrived, the operation had become a disaster that threatened to expose classified programs at the highest levels of government." She paused, letting the implications sink in. "The decision was made at levels far above my pay grade to declare the entire team killed in action. It was cleaner that way. No messy investigations, no congressional hearings, no questions about programs that couldn't be publicly acknowledged." Knox's confidence was wavering now, as the complexity of what he was hearing began to register. "But if you're alive, if any of you survived, the survivors were given new identities, new backgrounds, new lives," Evie said simply. "The people we had been died in Syria. What came back were ghosts, officially dead but unofficially tasked with missions that required complete deniability." The explanation was hitting the assembled SEALs like successive waves, each revelation more shocking than the last. They were witnessing the unveiling of a story that existed in the shadowy spaces between official history and classified reality. "That's," Knox started, then stopped, clearly struggling to process the implications. "That's impossible. You can't just disappear people like that." Evie's smile was sad and knowing. "Sergeant Knox, you have no idea what's possible when national security is at stake and unlimited resources are applied to making problems disappear." But Knox wasn't ready to surrender his position. The documentation he held represented 3 days of research, official channels, and the desperate need to prove that his original instincts had been correct. "Prove it," he said, his voice carrying the challenge across the silent mess hall. If what you're saying is true, prove it. Show us something that validates this story, because right now, all I have is official documentation that says Task Force Raven died in Syria. The demand hung in the air like a gauntlet thrown down in front of witnesses. Knox was essentially calling Evie's bluff, demanding physical evidence to support what sounded like an elaborate fantasy, designed to explain away stolen valor on an unprecedented scale. Evie looked at Knox for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then, without warning, she reached for the bottom hem of her black uniform shirt and began to pull it up, exposing her left forearm completely for the first time since the confrontations had begun. "Knox," she said quietly, "be careful what you ask for." What happened next would be burned into the memory of every person present for the rest of their lives. The shirt tore. Not deliberately, but because Knox's reflexive grab for her arm to stop her from what he thought was an inappropriate display caught the fabric at exactly the wrong angle. The sound of ripping cotton was sharp in the absolute silence of the mess hall, followed immediately by Knox's involuntary gasp as he realized what he had done. The torn sleeve fell away completely, exposing Evie's entire left forearm and upper arm in a way that had never been visible before. And there, rendered in intricate black ink with detail work that spoke of master-level artistry, was the complete Raven tattoo in all its magnificent and terrifying glory. The bird was massive, covering almost her entire forearm. Wings spread wide in full flight, each feather individually detailed with shading that made the ink seem to move in the fluorescent lighting. The raven's eyes were fierce, intelligent, predatory, the eyes of something that had seen death and emerged victorious. In its talons, clutched with unbreakable grip, was a lightning bolt that seemed to crackle with energy even in its static form. But it was the text below the raven that made every person in the mess hall stop breathing. In Gothic script that was clearly visible now, the words read, "Raven 7, never forget the fallen." And below that, in smaller text that was nonetheless perfectly legible, were 6 names. 6 names of warriors who had died in Operation Nightfall. 6 teammates who had made the ultimate sacrifice so that one could escape to tell the story. The silence that followed was so complete that the ventilation system seemed deafeningly loud. Knox's hand was still gripping the torn fabric, his mouth open in shock as he processed what he was seeing. The official documentation he had been holding slipped from his other hand and fluttered to the floor like a white flag of surrender. But Evie wasn't finished. With deliberate, careful movements, she rolled up the torn sleeve further, exposing her upper arm and shoulder. More ink was revealed. Not additional tattoos, but extensions of the raven design that told a story in visual form. Wrapped around her upper arm like a banner were coordinates, the exact location where Task Force Raven had made their last stand in Syria. Below that, a date, March 20th, 2017, the day the survivors had been extracted and officially declared dead. And on her shoulder, partially visible above the neckline of her torn shirt, was the edge of something that made Commander Walsh, who had been drawn to the mess hall by reports of another confrontation, stop dead in his tracks. It was the beginning of what appeared to be an American flag, but not the standard stars and stripes that adorned countless military tattoos. This flag was tattered, battle-worn, with holes that represented wounds taken and sacrifices made. It was the flag of someone who had bled for their country in ways that most people couldn't imagine. The collective intake of breath from the assembled SEALs was audible. Phones that had been recording came up to capture the moment, then slowly lowered as their owners realized they were witnessing something too sacred, too profound, too personal to be reduced to social media content. Knox's grip on the torn fabric loosened, his hand falling to his side as the magnitude of what he had unleashed began to register. This wasn't stolen valor. This wasn't fantasy. This was the living memorial of someone who had survived hell and chosen to honor the dead by carrying their memory in permanent ink. Commander Walsh stepped forward, his voice cutting through the silence with the authority of rank and the respect of recognition. "Master Chief Evelyn Thorne, call sign Raven 7, sole survivor of Operation Nightfall." The formal acknowledgement hit the mess hall like a hammer blow. Walsh's words carried the weight of official recognition, of classified knowledge, of truths that existed beyond the documentation Knox had been waving around. 7 went in, Walsh continued, his voice carrying across the silent room. 1 came out. The mission was classified at levels that require presidential authorization to discuss. The survivors were given new identities to protect ongoing operations and national security interests. He looked directly at Knox, his expression mixing disappointment with something approaching pity. Sergeant Knox, you've just forced the revelation of information that's classified above your clearance level, above my clearance level, and above the clearance level of everyone in this room except Master Chief Thorne herself. The implications were staggering. Knox had not only been wrong about stolen valor, he had essentially forced a classified operative to blow her cover in front of witnesses, potentially compromising ongoing operations and national security protocols. But Walsh wasn't finished with his revelations. "The tattoo you see," he said, his voice taking on the tone of someone delivering a briefing to subordinates, "is not just personal commemoration, it's operational art. Every element contains information that's relevant to ongoing classified programs." He gestured toward the exposed ink with the respect due to a war memorial. The coordinates mark not just where her teammates died, but where intelligence was gathered that prevented a terrorist attack on American soil. The date commemorates not just survival, but the beginning of operations that have saved hundreds of American lives over the past 6 years. The educational component was deliberate, designed to help the assembled SEALs understand that they were looking at something far more significant than personal body art. This was operational history, written in ink, carried by someone who had earned the right to bear witness to events that would never appear in history books. Knox found his voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "Master Chief, I had no idea. The documentation I found was exactly what it was supposed to be," Evie said, her voice gentle despite the magnitude of what had just been exposed. "Official records that protected operational security by declaring inconvenient truths to be classified fiction." She looked around the room, taking in the faces of young warriors who were processing lessons about the complexity of truth, the necessity of secrets, and the sacrifices made by people whose stories would never be fully told. "The hardest part of surviving," she continued, "isn't the physical wounds or the psychological trauma. It's carrying the weight of stories that can't be shared, honoring sacrifices that can't be acknowledged, and living with the knowledge that your teammates died so that missions could continue in their memory." The philosophical weight of her words settled over the mess hall like a blanket. These were warriors who understood sacrifice, but they were being confronted with levels of sacrifice that went beyond anything they had imagined. Mills stepped forward, his earlier shame now compounded by the understanding that he had participated in the humiliation of someone who represented the absolute pinnacle of military service and sacrifice. "Master Chief," he said, his voice heavy with emotion, "we owe you more than apologies. We owe you—" "You owe me nothing," Evie interrupted, beginning to pull her torn sleeve back down to cover the exposed tattoos. "You owe my teammates, the ones who didn't make it out, the promise that their sacrifices meant something. You owe them the commitment to be worthy of the freedoms they died protecting." But before she could cover the tattoos completely, something else became visible that made Commander Walsh step closer with increased attention. As Evie adjusted her torn shirt, the movement revealed additional ink that had been hidden by the neckline of her uniform. What Walsh could see now was unmistakably the edge of a larger piece, something that appeared to extend across her back and possibly her chest, suggesting a level of commemorative art that went far beyond what they had already witnessed. "Master Chief," Walsh said carefully, "if I may ask, is there additional operational significance to the ink that's not currently visible?" The question was delicate, probing, designed to determine whether there were additional classified elements that needed to be considered in terms of operational security. Evie's pause was telling. For the first time since the confrontations had begun, she seemed to be weighing whether additional revelation would serve any productive purpose or simply satisfy curiosity that might be better left unsatisfied. "Commander," she said finally, "some stories are meant to be carried privately. Some honors are meant to be borne in silence. What you've seen tonight is more than most people with my background ever reveal." The response was a masterclass in operational security, acknowledging that there were additional layers to the story, while making it clear that those layers would remain protected, regardless of curiosity or pressure. But Knox, still reeling from the complete destruction of his position and desperate to somehow redeem himself from the disaster he had created, pressed forward with one final question. "Master Chief, if everything you've said is true, if you really are who you claim to be, then why are you here? Why work in a mess hall when you could be anywhere, doing anything with your background and credentials?" The question was fair, reasonable, and exactly the kind of inquiry that demonstrated Knox was finally beginning to think like an analyst rather than a bully. Evie's answer would become legendary among the SEALs who heard it, repeated in training sessions and leadership discussions for years to come. "Because this matters," she said simply. "Feeding warriors matters. Making sure you have the fuel you need to do your jobs matters. Service doesn't end when the mission changes. It just takes different forms." She gestured around the mess hall, taking in the tables, where young SEALs sat in stunned silence, processing lessons about service, sacrifice, and the complexity of heroism. "Every one of you will deploy again. Some of you will face situations where the difference between success and failure, between coming home and not coming home, will be measured in small margins. How well you've been trained, how well you've been fed, how well you've been prepared by people who understand what you're facing." Her voice carried the authority of someone who had lived through the experiences she was describing, who understood the connection between support and survival in ways that most people never would. "My teammates died so that intelligence could reach decision makers who prevented attacks on American soil. I serve food so that the next generation of warriors has the strength to prevent future attacks." The mission continues, Sergeant Knox. It just looks different from the outside. The explanation encapsulated everything the assembled SEALs were beginning to understand about service, purpose, and the ways that military values could be applied across different contexts and challenges. Military veterans transitioning to civilian careers often face unique financial challenges that require specialized investment and insurance solutions. Professional financial services designed specifically for former special operations personnel provide comprehensive wealth management, retirement planning, and risk assessment that accounts for the unique career patterns and compensation structures of military service. These specialized financial products offer the security and growth potential that veterans need to build long-term financial stability. The conversation about Evie's transition from classified operations to mess hall service had opened broader discussions about the challenges faced by all veterans, particularly those transitioning from high-intensity, high classification roles to civilian life. The financial, psychological, and social adjustments required were complex and often underestimated by support systems designed for conventional military transitions. As the immediate shock of the revelation began to settle, Commander Walsh found himself dealing with operational security considerations that went far beyond normal base management. The presence of a classified operative working undercover, even in retirement, created complications that would require coordination with higher authorities. "Master Chief," Walsh said, pulling her aside as the crowd of SEALs began to disperse, "we need to discuss the security implications of what just happened. The exposure of your background and operational history may require protocol adjustments." Evie's nod indicated that she had been expecting this conversation. "I understand, Commander. I'm prepared to relocate if necessary, though I hope it won't come to that. This assignment has been personally meaningful." The admission that her work at the base had been more than just a job, that it had provided something she needed in her transition from operational life, added another layer to the complexity of her situation. Walsh's expression was thoughtful as he considered the implications. "Master Chief, with your permission, I'd like to reach out to some contacts in Washington. There may be ways to formalize your status here that would provide operational security while allowing you to continue the work you've chosen." The suggestion that her position could be officially recognized and protected was intriguing, offering a potential solution that would allow her to continue serving while acknowledging the reality of her background and qualifications. As they spoke, Knox approached with obvious reluctance, his earlier confidence completely replaced by a humility that bordered on self-destruction. "Master Chief, Commander Walsh," he said, his voice barely audible, "I need to take full responsibility for what happened tonight. My actions forced the compromise of classified information and potentially endangered operational security. I'm prepared to face whatever consequences are appropriate." The acknowledgement was mature, professional, and exactly the kind of accountability that demonstrated genuine learning from a catastrophic mistake. Evie looked at Knox with an expression that mixed understanding with something approaching compassion. "Sergeant Knox, you made a mistake, a serious one, but you also demonstrated the kind of investigative persistence that could be valuable if properly directed. The question is whether you learn from this experience or let it define you." The response was characteristic, turning a moment of failure into an opportunity for growth, helping someone understand that redemption was possible, even after serious mistakes. Walsh nodded approvingly. Knox, you'll be transferred to intelligence analysis training. Your skills at research and investigation need proper development and appropriate application. Consider this a career redirection rather than a career termination. The assignment was both punishment and opportunity, removing Knox from operational roles where his judgment had proven problematic, while utilizing his demonstrated analytical abilities in contexts where they could be productive. As the evening continued, the mess hall gradually returned to something approaching normal operations, but the atmosphere had been permanently altered by the night's revelations. Young SEALs who had witnessed the confrontation and revelation were processing lessons about assumption, respect, and the complexity of the people around them. Rodriguez, the young petty officer who had previously approached Evie to apologize for his inaction, found himself struggling with questions about courage, moral responsibility, and the nature of heroism. "Master Chief," he said during a quiet moment, "how do you know when you're being courageous versus when you're just being reckless? Tonight, standing up to Knox might have been the right thing to do, but it also might have made things worse." The question demonstrated sophisticated thinking about leadership, intervention, and the complexity of moral decision-making under pressure. Evie's response was immediate and practical. Courage is acting according to your values despite personal risk. Recklessness is acting without considering consequences. The difference is often measured in preparation, thought, and understanding of what you're trying to accomplish. She paused, considering how to help Rodriguez understand the nuances of moral courage in practical terms. Tonight, intervention might have prevented some humiliation, but it also might have prevented learning. Sometimes the most courageous thing you can do is allow people to make mistakes that will teach them lessons they need to learn. The explanation was sophisticated, acknowledging that moral courage sometimes required accepting short-term harm in service of long-term growth and education. As the night wound down and the mess hall prepared to close, Evie found herself surrounded by young warriors who wanted to continue the conversations that had begun with such dramatic revelations. The formal barriers between civilian employee and military personnel had been permanently altered by the understanding of who she really was and what she represented. "Master Chief," asked a young seaman who had remained silent throughout the evening's events, "what advice would you give to someone who's beginning their career in special operations? What should we know that they don't teach in training?" The question was broad, fundamental, and exactly the kind of inquiry that demonstrated these young warriors were ready to think beyond tactics and techniques to consider the deeper aspects of their chosen profession. Evie's answer would be remembered and repeated by everyone who heard it. "The most important weapon you'll ever carry is your judgment," she said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had tested that principle under the most extreme circumstances imaginable. "Physical skills can be taught, tactics can be memorized, equipment can be mastered. But judgment, the ability to make good decisions under pressure, to distinguish between right and wrong when the stakes are highest, to choose mission success over personal comfort, that has to be developed through experience, reflection, and constant commitment to values larger than yourself." She looked around the room, making eye contact with each of the young faces that were hanging on her every word. "You'll face situations where the easy choice and the right choice are different things, where following orders conflicts with following your conscience, where the mission requires sacrifices that will cost you personally but benefit people you'll never meet." The weight of her words was settling on the assembled SEALs like a physical presence, forcing them to confront aspects of their chosen profession that went far beyond the adventure and brotherhood that had originally attracted them. "In those moments," Evie continued, "your judgment will be the difference between being a warrior and being a weapon. Warriors serve values, weapons serve whoever holds them. The choice between those two things will define not just your career, but your character." The philosophical depth of her guidance was exactly what these young warriors needed to hear, not platitudes about courage and honor, but practical wisdom about the moral complexity they would face as their careers developed. Advanced tactical training programs and specialized military education courses provide professional development opportunities that enhance career prospects for both active duty and veteran personnel. These comprehensive educational frameworks offer certifications in leadership, advanced technical skills, and strategic planning that translate directly to civilian career advancement. Professional military education services ensure that service members and veterans can leverage their unique experience and training in competitive civilian markets. The educational conversation had evolved from immediate crisis management to broader questions about professional development, career planning, and the application of military values in various contexts. The young SEALs present were beginning to understand that their training was just the beginning of a lifelong education in leadership, ethics, and service. As the formal end of the evening approached, Commander Walsh returned to address both Evie and the assembled personnel with information about the administrative and operational adjustments that would follow the night's revelations. "Ladies and gentlemen," Walsh began, his voice carrying the formal tone of official announcements, "tonight's events have created some unique circumstances that require appropriate response from command." The attention of everyone present focused immediately on Walsh, understanding that whatever he was about to announce would affect not just Evie, but potentially everyone who had witnessed the revelations. "After consultation with higher authority," Walsh continued, "Master Chief Thorne's position at this facility has been officially recognized and reclassified. She will continue her current duties, but with appropriate acknowledgement of her background and qualifications." The announcement was met with nods of approval from the assembled SEALs, who had struggled with the disconnect between Evie's obvious expertise and her civilian employee status. "Additionally," Walsh said, "Master Chief Thorne has agreed to provide informal mentoring and leadership development for personnel at this facility. Her experience and perspective will be valuable resources for professional development." The formalization of what had already begun informally was a practical solution that would allow Evie to continue the work she had chosen while providing official recognition and protection for her unique situation. "Finally," Walsh concluded, "I want to emphasize that operational security considerations require that tonight's revelations remain within this facility. Master Chief Thorne's background and current status are not matters for public discussion or social media sharing." The reminder about operational security was necessary, given the number of phones that had been present during the evening's events and the natural tendency of young warriors to share dramatic stories with their peers. Knox, who had remained largely silent since his final apology, stepped forward with obvious difficulty. "Commander Walsh, Master Chief Thorne," he said, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had learned hard lessons about assumption and humility, "I want to formally request transfer to whatever assignment would be most beneficial for my professional development and least problematic for unit cohesion." The request was mature, selfless, and demonstrated genuine understanding that his presence at the facility had become complicated by his role in the evening's events. Evie's response was immediate and surprising. "Sergeant Knox, I think you should stay. Your experience tonight, both the mistakes you made and the lessons you learned, could be valuable for helping other young warriors understand the complexity of leadership and judgment." The suggestion that Knox's failure could be transformed into a teaching tool was characteristic of Evie's approach to leadership, finding ways to extract value from difficult experiences and use them for broader educational purposes. Walsh nodded thoughtfully. "Knox, you'll remain at this facility, but with additional responsibilities for leadership development and education. Your experience will be incorporated into training programs designed to help others avoid similar mistakes." The assignment was both redemptive and productive, allowing Knox to atone for his errors while contributing to the education of future leaders. As the evening finally wound down and personnel began to leave the mess hall, the transformation that had begun with cruel entertainment and evolved through dramatic revelation was completing itself with practical adjustments that would affect everyone involved. Evie found herself approached by Murphy, who had observed the entire evening's events with the wisdom of someone who had seen similar transformations play out over decades of military service. "Master Chief," Murphy said, refilling her coffee cup one final time, "I've been feeding warriors for more than 20 years. I've seen heroes, legends, and everything in between, but I've never seen someone turn a personal attack into a teaching moment for an entire command, quite like what you did tonight." Evie's response was characteristic in its deflection of personal credit. "Chief Murphy, good leaders don't create teaching moments. They recognize them when they occur and try to extract maximum value for everyone involved." The humility in her response only reinforced the lessons that the assembled SEALs had been learning about true leadership, authentic service, and the difference between authority based on position and authority based on character. As the mess hall finally emptied and Evie prepared to end her shift, she found herself reflecting on the evening's events and their implications for her carefully constructed post-operational life. The revelation of her background had been inevitable. Too many people were asking too many questions for her cover to remain intact indefinitely. But the way the revelation had occurred, and the response it had generated, suggested that her transition from classified operations to open service might be more successful than she had originally hoped. The young warriors she would now be formally mentoring represented the future of American Special Operations. Their willingness to learn from failure, to question their assumptions, and to embrace complexity rather than seeking simple answers gave her hope that the sacrifices she and her teammates had made would continue to have meaning in the next generation of warriors. The raven tattoo that had started as a target for mockery had become a symbol of something much larger. The understanding that heroism comes in many forms, that service continues beyond official recognition, and that the most important battles are often fought in the quiet moments when character is tested and values are proven. As Evie turned off the lights in the mess hall and prepared to leave, her phone buzzed with an encrypted message that would change everything once again. The text was brief, coded, and unmistakable in its implications. Raven 7, new mission parameters, report to coordinates 38.97777.0365 within 72 hours. Priority Alpha, the watch continues. The coordinates place the meeting location somewhere in Washington, D.C., in an area that housed some of the most classified operations in the American intelligence community. The priority level indicated mission-critical importance that would supersede all other commitments. Evie looked around the empty mess hall one final time, taking in the space where she had found purpose, peace, and the opportunity to serve in a different way. The young warriors she had been mentoring would continue their development under other guidance, but the lessons they had learned about respect, assumption, and the complexity of heroism would stay with them throughout their careers. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a challenge coin that she had carried since Operation Nightfall, worn, scratched, with a raven wrapped around a sword on one side and the number 7 on the other. Setting it on the table where she had spent so many evenings in conversation with young warriors, she left behind a tangible reminder of the lessons that had been taught and learned. The coin would be found the next morning by Rodriguez, who would recognize its significance and understand that Master Chief Evelyn Thorne, Raven 7, had moved on to whatever mission required her unique skills and experience. But her impact on Naval Special Warfare Command would be permanent. The young SEALs who had witnessed her revelation and learned from her mentoring would carry those lessons forward throughout their careers, becoming leaders who understood that true strength often comes disguised as vulnerability, that service takes many forms, and that heroes walk among us every day. The story of the night Master Chief Evelyn Thorne revealed her identity in a military mess hall would become legend, told and retold in training sessions, leadership schools, and wherever young warriors gathered to discuss the meaning of service and sacrifice. But the real impact wasn't in the dramatic moment of revelation. It was in the quiet, daily example of someone who had achieved the highest levels of professional success and chosen to continue serving with humility, grace, and commitment to values larger than personal recognition. The raven flies silent, sees all, protects all, and sometimes, when circumstances demand it, the raven reveals itself just long enough to teach lessons that will be remembered long after the teacher has moved on to the next mission. As Evie walked out of Naval Special Warfare Command for the final time, she carried with her the satisfaction of knowing that her brief time as a mess hall worker had accomplished something that might be more important than any classified operation she had ever conducted. She had helped create the next generation of leaders who would understand that true warriors serve because they believe in the mission, not because they want recognition for their sacrifice. And in a world where heroism was often confused with celebrity, that lesson might be the most important mission of all. The phone buzzed again with additional mission details that would require her immediate attention. But as she climbed into her pickup truck and drove away from the base where she had found unexpected purpose and meaning, Master Chief Evelyn Thorne, call sign Raven 7, smiled with the knowledge that some missions never really end. They just evolve into new challenges that require the same commitment to service above self that had defined her entire career. The watch continues, and somewhere, in another mess hall or another quiet corner of military life, another hero was probably serving in anonymity, waiting for the moment when circumstances would reveal their true nature and teach the next generation what it really means to serve. As Evie drove through the quiet streets leading away from the base, her rearview mirror caught the headlights of a black sedan that had been following her for the past 3 miles. The surveillance was professional, but not invisible. Exactly the kind of tale that was meant to be noticed by someone with her training. She pulled into a 24-hour diner 2 miles from the base, choosing a parking spot that provided multiple exit routes and clear sight lines to approaching vehicles. The sedan continued past without stopping, but she caught a glimpse of government plates in her peripheral vision. Inside the diner, she chose a corner booth that allowed her to monitor both entrances while appearing to focus on the coffee and pie she ordered from a waitress who had clearly seen everything life could offer. The encrypted phone buzzed again with coordinates that had shifted slightly, a sign that the mission parameters were evolving in real time. 20 minutes later, Commander Walsh entered the diner alone, his civilian clothes doing nothing to disguise his military bearing. He spotted her immediately and approached with the careful respect of someone who understood he was dealing with operational complexity far above his clearance level. "Master Chief," he said, sliding into the booth across from her, "I thought you should know that 3 different federal agencies have called in the past hour, asking about your status and availability." Evie's expression didn't change, but her posture shifted almost imperceptibly into a more alert configuration. "Commander, with respect, this conversation could compromise both of us if it continues." Walsh nodded, understanding the implications. "I just wanted you to know that whatever brought you to our facility and whatever is calling you away, you made a difference. Those young warriors will be better leaders because of what they learned from you." He stood to leave, then paused. "The challenge coin you left, Rodriguez found it. He started a tradition where new SEALs have to earn the right to hear the story of Raven 7. Your legend is already growing." As Walsh left, Evie's phone displayed a final message. "Extraction in progress, new identity prepared. Welcome back to the shadows, Raven 7. She left money on the table and walked back to her truck, knowing that Evelyn Thorne, the mess hall worker, was about to disappear as completely as if she had never existed. But the lessons she had taught would echo through Naval Special Warfare Command for generations, proof that sometimes the most important missions are the ones that never appear in any official record. The Raven was returning to flight,